A band that has existed for a matter of weeks is finishing its first record. There are three of the most technically gifted players in Britain, and they know it. The whole point of them is virtuosity. In the corner sits a machine that costs £4,000, a Moog modular synthesizer, shipped over from America, barely understood by anyone in the room. The keyboard player has hardly had time to learn it. The album is almost done. There's tape left at the end of one reel. And the song they are finishing is the one nobody fought for, the simplest thing on the record, written by the singer when he was 12 years old. What happens in the next few minutes will become the most famous passage of music this band ever records. And the man who plays it will spend the rest of the day trying to stop them from keeping it. This is the story of Lucky Man. To understand why that afternoon mattered, you have to understand what was at stake for the three men in the room. Emerson, Lake, and Palmer were not a band that grew up together in a garage. They were assembled. Keith Emerson arrived from the Nice, already notorious for what he could do to Hammond organ and to the audience's expectations. Greg Lake came directly from King Crimson.
And started to look around, finding a drummer. We decided we were going to keep it as a three-piece band.
His voice and his bass having anchored one of the most talked about debuts of the previous year. Carl Palmer was the youngest, pulled from Atomic Rooster, a drummer whose hands seemed to operate on a different clock from everyone else's. They came together in 1970 with enormous expectation and almost no shared history. The press was already watching.
It was one of those understandings that none of us really, we knew what both of us did, so that said it all, really.
The term that would follow them around for the rest of the decade, supergroup, was being printed before they had played a note in public.
With our performance at the Isle of Wight, they were very aware of the fact that this was apparently a supergroup made up from Greg from King Crimson and Carl from The Crazy World of Arthur Brown and myself from The Nice. So there was a lot of expectations.
And they had made a very expensive bet, that Moog, £4,000 at a time when you could buy a house for not much more. It was a symbol of everything they intended to be, bigger, more advanced, more ambitious than the bands they had left behind.
Emotional sort of connection between all of us at that time were probably like it is with any group. You had three young men who wanted to prove to the world that they could be the greatest. We were kind of rebellious, I suppose. We wanted to push the envelope. We wanted to be involved in technology. We wanted to use this kind of Englishness that we had, which was to use a classical adaptations. We wanted to do a ton of stuff.
So here's the tension at the heart of the whole story. A group built entirely on the premise of virtuosity and technology. And the song that would introduce them to the most of the world was none of those things. It was a folk song, 3 chords, written by a child. Greg Lake was 12 years old when he wrote Lucky Man. He had just been given his first guitar.
When I was 12 years old, I was round my friend's house and he had a broken down old guitar.
He knew, by his own account, only a handful of chords, the small vocabulary every beginner starts with.
With these chords, I wrote this little song, the kid's song really, and it was a medieval fantasy.
And out of that limited vocabulary came a complete song, a melody, a lyric, a shape that held it all together. A medieval think tale of a man who had everything, wealth, status, the favor of a king, and whose luck ran out anyway on a battlefield. Think about what that means for a moment. Not a polish, there is none, and it doesn't need any. What is remarkable is that the song was finished. A 12-year-old with 4 chords does not usually produce something with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Lake did. And then he did the thing that matters most to this story. He kept it. For years, Lucky Man traveled with him as a private possession. through his teams, through the bands that went nowhere, through his arrival in King Crimson, where the material was about as far from a simple acoustic ballad as English rock music got in 1969. Angular, dark, complex. There was no place for children folk song in 21st century schizoid man, so it stayed in the drawer. This is something the audience for this channel will recognize instinctively, as songwriters carry these things for decades. The unfashionable song, the one that doesn't fit the band you happen to be in, the one you don't play for anyone because it's too simple, too old, it's too personal. But Lake had carried this since his childhood. What he could not have known was that the song's moment would arrive, not because it suited the band, but precisely because it didn't. By July 1970, the debut album was nearly complete, recorded at Vision Studios, produced by Lake himself, a significant detail because it meant that when decisions came down to the wire, the man with the most modest song on the record also had his hand on the controls. And the record was short. They needed material.
Lucky Man was an afterthought on the first DLP album. We'd been in the studio for a month or 6 weeks, and we'd finished the album. We'd recorded all the material we had, and we were still one song short.
The pieces that defined the album's ambition were already there. The adaptation of Bartok, the long suites, the keyboard showcases that announced exactly what Keith Emerson intended to do to rock music. What they did not have was something to round the record off, something smaller.
We got to the end of the record, and we were one track short,
Lake suggested Lucky Man.
and there was deadly silence. So I said, well, look, I've got this little thing I wrote when I was a kid.
By several accounts, the idea was met with something less than enthusiasm. This was not the kind of music the band had formed to make. It was the opposite of those theses.
The thing is, we've got nothing else. Keith said, well, you record it on your own.
And so the way the recording proceeded tells you a great deal. Lake essentially built the track himself. The acoustic guitars layered, the vocal, the bass, the electric guitar, the arrangement grew under his hands, in his own production. A quiet song assembled almost in private, while the larger ambitions of the album sat finished around it.
In the end, it sounded pretty good. It sounded like a record.
Here's the reversal. The song nobody believed in was turning into the most complete thing on the record.
Eventually, Keith came back from the pub and he heard it and was shocked. And so he said, wow, I suppose I better play on that.
The arrangement built and built, and they simply needed somewhere to go. And at the end of the session, there was tape left on the reel. This is the moment everything turns on, not a plan, not an arrangement worked out for weeks, a few feet of blank tape, and the 4,000-pound machine sitting in the corner that almost nobody knew how to drive.
So Keith went out into the next room and he said, run the track then for an experiment.
We should talk about that machine because it's the other main character in this story. The Moog modular was not an instrument you switched on and played. It was a wall.
So I flipped it in record and pressed play.
A system of separate modules connected by patch cables, each one shaping a different aspect of the sound.
And because he was experimenting, we didn't really listen. In fact, we put the speakers on dim. The track went through and
The oscillators, the filters, the envelopes. To make a single note, you had to build it. To change the sound, you had to physically rewire it.
They weren't made to be used in live performance.
And the tuning drifted. It drifted constantly with temperature, with time, with the room.
They were actually intended by Robert to be used in a studio.
Keeping a Moog in tune for the length of a take was a job in itself. This was bleeding-edge technology in 1970. The instrument had barely appeared on rock records at all, and Emerson's machine had only recently arrived. He had had little time to live with it, to learn its temperament, to find out what it would and wouldn't do.
It was in the very early days, and I really hadn't uh, got really in touch with the Moog synthesizer. It was still a very complicated instrument, that it, in some way, it still is. But
So when Lake turned to him at the end of the Lucky Man session and suggested he try something over the ending, Emerson was, by his own description, just jamming around, feeling his way across an instrument he barely knew on a song he hadn't wanted to play on in the first place. And what came out was extraordinary. The solo that closes Lucky Man leans heavily on portamento, that swooping glide between notes, the pitch sliding rather than stepping. It is vocal, it is almost human. It rises up out of the acoustic guitars like something arriving from the future, because in a sense it was. To a listener in 1971, this was a sound with almost no precedent on a hit record. Not a guitar, not an organ, something else entirely. It was one of the first prominent Moog solos in the history of rock music, and it was essentially an improvisation captured by accident.
the take that went on to the record, and everybody knows, and the Moog solo at the end, was a complete one-off, and I was just experimenting, and I had some ideas coming, so I just did a pass over this last bit.
Now, here's the part that almost nobody knows. Keith Emerson didn't want that solo kept. To him, it was a sketch, a first pass, the kind of thing any serious musician plays to find his way into an idea, fully expecting to come back and do it properly.
And I said, well, that was just a rough take, you know.
He was, as he later put it, devastated to discover that the take was going onto the record. Devastated because every track on the tape had been used and there was no room left to try again.
And the other thing which really disturbed me was I didn't think it was truly representative. I didn't think that Lucky Man was truly representative of the rest of what ELP were doing, which was very groundbreaking stuff, you know.
Okay, that's like, I mean, the single most famous thing Emerson, Lake, and Parvan ever recorded, the passage that introduced an entire audience to the synthesizer, was a take that the man who played it considered unfinished. He wanted another go. He never got one.
We've only got this track left. If you do another one, we wipe this one out.
Why was it kept? Because it was right. Because Greg Lake, sitting in the producer's chair, heard something that the player himself was too close to hear.
I think you've got to listen to it because we think it's a keeper.
The imperfection was the point, the hesitancy, the searching quality, the sense of a human being feeling across a machine in real time.
So in the end, after a lot of toing and froing, Keith came in and heard it, and then it was game, set, match, and that became the record.
That was not what made it bleed. A cleaner, more deliberate solo would almost certainly have been worse. This is the central paradox of that record, and it is worth saying plainly. A band founded on control, on precision, on years of technique, and their breakthrough moment was one thing they couldn't control, the accident they decided to trust. And they were right to trust it. Lucky Man was released as a single in December 1970. In the United States, it reached number 48 on the Billboard Hot 100, entering the chart in March 1971 and staying there for 12 weeks. It went to number 25 in Canada, number 14 in Netherlands. So it was successful enough that it was sent out again 2 years later in 1972 and charted a second time. Now hold those numbers against everything else on the album, the Bartok adaptation, the Streets, the thunderous keyboard showpieces that the band had actually formed to make. None of those was the song that walked Emerson, Lake, and Palmer into living rooms across America. It was the folk song, the one written by 12-year-old, the one Emerson hadn't wanted to play on, ending with a solo he'd wanted to throw away. For a band whose entire identity was complexity, their door into the mainstream was simplicity. And the irony deepens the closer you look. The element that made the song unforgettable, that Moog solo, was the most advanced thing on the record and the least planned. The newest technology in the building played almost by accident on the oldest and plainest song in the set.
And of course, that solo became world famous, and to this day is a landmark, really, in electronic music.
That tension would define the whole of progressive rock in the years that followed. The constant pull between the human and the machine, the simple and the baroque, the song and the spectacle. It's all there in miniature in 3.5 minutes, recorded on a leftover scrap of a tape in the summer of 1970.
Well, I think for me, it defined what we know today as progressive music. It was certainly a gift because, as Howard probably knows, it wasn't easy to get your keyboard sounds to be above a guitar player.
There is a temptation to file Lucky Man away as a happy accident, the supergroup that stumbled into a hit, the throwaway song that did better than the serious ones. But that misreads what actually happened in that run. A man carried a song from childhood for the better part of 2 decades, believing in it long after it had stopped being fashionable. When the moment came, he trusted it enough to build it alone, against the grain of his own band. And then, sitting at the controls, he trusted something else, a colleague's unrepeatable mistake, enough to leave it untouched over that musician's objection. None of that is luck, that is judgment, the hardest kind, knowing when not to fix something. The synthesizer would go on to remake popular music entirely over the following decade. But for a great many people, the first time they ever really heard one, the first time it stopped being a curiosity and became a voice, was the last 90 seconds of a song about a man whose luck ran out. The machine that was meant to represent the future announced itself through the oldest song in the room, and the band, built on virtuosity, is remembered more than anything for the moment they let go of it. That was the lucky part. The rest was 12-year-old who never threw anything away. Thank you for watching. It was a pleasure, and please subscribe, like, comment what you would like to see next on the channel. Thank you for your patience and for your time.